It was February, the kind of cold that gets into door frames and stays there. I was 31 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen on a Sunday, and my mother was on the other side of the table telling me I had a choice to make. The chicken she'd brought over was still in the foil pan. She hadn't even set it down properly. It was balanced on the edge of the counter, half on, half off, and I kept looking at it while she talked, waiting for it to fall. It didn't fall. She said his name once like it was a diagnosis. Then she said mine like I was the disease. My grandmother was in the next room. I could hear the television. She didn't come in. That was 11 years ago now. And the thing you won't see coming, the thing I didn't see coming, is that when my mother finally showed up at my door again 9 years later, she didn't come to apologize. She came because she needed something. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel about family, money, loyalty, and the people who finally stop apologizing. If you're watching this, you already know how these stories feel from the inside. Drop where you're listening from in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this one goes somewhere most of them don't. My grandmother's name was Dorothy May. Everyone called her Dot. She was 78 years old when this story starts, and she had been the practical center of our family for as long as anyone could remember. Not because she was loud, but because she was the one who showed up. She showed up with food when there was a funeral. She showed up with cash out of her purse folded twice when there was a shortfall. She showed up to the hospital at 2 in the morning and sat in a plastic chair without complaint. She was a small woman, 5'2" on a good day. She wore house slippers until noon and changed into her good shoes only if she was going somewhere that mattered. She drove a 1997 Buick LeSabre that she called the boat and refused to replace. The ashtray was full of loose change and expired coupons. The passenger seat had a permanent dent where she kept her purse. She had a coffee mug she'd been using since the 1980s. It was white with a faded blue flower on it, and the handle had been superglued back on at some point badly, so it sat slightly crooked. She refused to throw it out. She said it held heat better than any new cup she'd tried, which was not true, but she believed it. She also had a notebook. A small one, the composition kind, black and white marbled cover. She kept it in her cardigan pocket or on the kitchen table, and she wrote things in it that she didn't say out loud. Phone numbers, appointments, amounts. She never showed anyone what was in it. I should have asked about the notebook earlier. But you don't ask Dorothy May things she hasn't offered. You just learn to watch. The arrangement, and there was one, though it was never called that, was this. My mother, her eldest daughter, had been managing Grandma Dot's finances for years. Paying bills, taking her to the bank, handling what she called the paperwork. My grandmother had a modest savings account, a paid-off house, and a small annuity from my grandfather's pension. Not a fortune, but something. My mother was not paid for this. That was the stated version. My grandmother said to me once, the summer before everything changed, "Your mother is good at keeping track of things." She said it the way you describe someone who was good at keeping score. Not a compliment exactly. More like a fact she'd been sitting with for a while. I didn't understand it then. At the time my mother delivered her ultimatum across the chicken on the counter, I was not doing well. I had left a marketing job the year before to start a small consulting business with a friend, and the friend had left 6 months in, taking most of the clients. I was working out of a second bedroom in the apartment Marcus and I shared. Marcus, my husband, the man whose name my mother had said like a diagnosis. The apartment was 840 square feet. The second bedroom was barely enough for a desk and a filing cabinet. The filing cabinet didn't close all the way. I had $11,000 in savings, a freelance contract that paid inconsistently, and a husband who worked nights at a hospital doing facilities management, which meant we rarely ate dinner together, and I spent a lot of evenings alone with spreadsheets. We were not unhappy, but we were not winning. And when my mother made her declaration and my grandmother stayed in the other room, and my family fell away from me like something that had never been bolted down properly, I almost let it go. I almost just stayed gone. I almost didn't show up. But I called my grandmother the next week. She answered on the second ring. She said, "I was wondering when you'd call." She didn't say anything about my mother. I drove over on Thursday. What happened next was not a single event. It was a policy my mother implemented quietly, the way people implement things they don't want examined. She stopped bringing my grandmother to family dinners when she knew I'd be there. She began answering my grandmother's phone. I know this because Grandma mentioned it once lightly, the way she mentioned things she wanted me to notice without asking me to do anything about them yet. She said, "Your mother likes to know who's calling." Then she started coming to the house more. More frequently, more regularly, more with purpose. She had a key. She'd always had a key. One afternoon in March, I came by with groceries and let myself in and found my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table looking at a piece of paper. When she heard me at the door, she folded it. She put it in the notebook pocket of her cardigan. She looked up at me and said, "Good. You're here. I need someone to take me to the pharmacy." I took her to the pharmacy. When I helped her out of the car on the way back, she held my arm a little longer than she needed to. She said, "You know what I always said about bank accounts?" I said I didn't. She said, "If someone else knows the number better than you do, it's not really yours anymore." I thought she was talking about getting older, about memory, about the general indignity of needing help with things. She wasn't. I found out later that my mother had been making withdrawals. Not enormous ones. The kind that don't trip alarms. The kind that look like ordinary expenses over time if no one is adding them up. But my grandmother was adding them up. She'd been adding them up in the notebook. After the pharmacy visit, I started coming by twice a week. Sometimes 3 times. My mother had made it clear. Not to me, she wouldn't speak to me directly, but through cousins, through second-hand comments that arrived like weather reports, that my visiting was disrespectful, that I was making things harder, that I was pushing my lifestyle on an old woman who just wanted peace. That was the word she used for what I was doing. Pushing. I drove Grandma to her cardiologist appointments. I sat in the waiting room with a legal pad and wrote down questions to ask the doctor and wrote down what the doctor said. Her insurance had a gap in coverage for one of her medications, and I spent 3 hours on the phone with the insurance company over 2 weeks getting it resolved. 3 hours. 2 weeks. A $17 copay reduction. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. I wasn't doing it to score points. I was doing it because she was my grandmother and she had answered on the second ring. Marcus would ask when I came home late on those nights how she was doing. He'd never met her. My mother had made sure of that. But he asked every time by name. He'd say, "How's Miss Dot today?" I'd say she was the same. He'd say, "The same is good." He didn't know the same was getting slower, smaller, more careful. He didn't know she was losing weight. He didn't know that some Thursday afternoon she'd fall asleep in the passenger seat of my car on the way home from the cardiologist, the notebook still in her pocket, and I'd sit in her driveway for a few minutes before waking her because she looked peaceful and I didn't want to rush anything. I kept a separate spreadsheet. Medical appointments, medication refills, expenses I covered, dates. Not to use as a weapon. I just needed the information to exist somewhere other than my memory. My grandmother and I had started something the previous spring. Before all of this, before the kitchen and the chicken on the counter. She had mentioned once that she used to sew. That she'd made quilts for everyone when she was younger, and then stopped because her eyes got bad and her hands got stiff and there wasn't time. I'd bought her one of those quilting kits, the kind with large pieces and simple patterns, and she'd laughed at me for it. But the next time I came over, the kit was open on the dining room table. We started working on it together. The cut she arranged. She told me what went where. It was slow. We didn't finish it that winter. We didn't finish it the next winter either. But it was on the dining room table every time I came over. A little more done than the last time. One afternoon, sewing or watching me try to sew, she said out of nowhere, "I've been very careful about the house." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean I've been careful. About the paperwork." Then she said, "You'll drive me Thursday?" It wasn't a question. If you've ever quietly carried something heavier than your budget for someone who deserved it, and said nothing and kept showing up, comment Thursdays below. Subscribe if you haven't. Because this does not end where you think it ends. It was a Tuesday and I had come by to drop off groceries, not to stay. The house was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. I came in through the side door into the kitchen and called out and she didn't answer, which wasn't unusual either. She sometimes fell asleep in the afternoon. I put the groceries away. I went to check on her and she was in the armchair asleep, the television on low. On the kitchen table was the notebook. It was open. I don't know if she left it open by accident. I don't know if it was intentional. I know that I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, looking at it from across the room, and I could see numbers, columns, dates. I walked over to the table. I looked at it long enough to understand what I was looking at. Then I closed it. I put it back where it had been, the same orientation, the cover facing the same direction. I went and sat in the other armchair and waited for her to wake up. When she opened her eyes, she looked at me for a moment before she said anything. Then she said, "You'll drive me Thursday." She said it the same way she always said it. No inflection. No acknowledgement of the notebook. No question mark. I said yes. She nodded. She picked up the remote and turned up the television slightly. That was all she said about it. And I understood, in the way you understand things that are communicated without being spoken, that she had seen me close it. That she had needed to know what I would do with it before she did what she was planning to do. I had passed something. I didn't know the name of it. I just knew I had not taken anything that wasn't mine to take. I drove her Thursday. The last good evening was in October. I came over and she had made soup. She didn't cook much anymore, but she had made soup, the kind her mother had made, with the beans she had to soak overnight. She'd been planning it. She had everything laid out on the counter the way she laid things out when she was cooking with intention. We ate at the kitchen table. She asked about Marcus, which she did sometimes but not always. I told her about a problem he'd been having at work, something minor, and she listened and said, "He sounds steady." I said he was. She said, "Steady is the thing people underestimate." We washed the dishes together. She washed, I dried. She handed me the crooked-handled mug last and I dried it carefully, the way I'd learned to, gently around the glued handle, and put it on the shelf where it always went. She said, "I think that quilt is going to be finished before Christmas." I said, "You've been saying that for 2 years." She laughed. An actual laugh, short and real. She said, "You know, your grandfather was the worrier. I never was. I always figured things worked out the right way eventually." I made a joke. I said, "That's a nice way to be." She said, "It's not nice. It's just true." She went to bed at 9 o'clock. She always went to bed at 9. I let myself out the side door and drove home. I knew before I opened the door. It was a Thursday morning. I had been planning to take her to her cardiologist's follow-up at 11. I knocked, which I didn't usually do, and then I waited longer than I should have, and then I used my key. She was in the bedroom. She had passed in her sleep. She had folded her clothes over the chair the way she always did before bed. Her good shoes were on the floor next to the chair, toes pointed toward the door, the way she always placed them. Ready to go somewhere that mattered. The crooked-handled mug was on the kitchen counter, washed. The light over the stove was on. She left it on for me on Thursday morning so I could find my way in if she was still getting ready. Called 911. I called the funeral home she had already designated, the information for which was, I found out later, in the notebook. My mother called me 45 minutes later. The first thing she said was, "Did she say anything?" "About the house." The funeral was at the church she'd attended for 40 years. My mother wore black and held her tissues and received every mourner with the weight of a woman who had given everything. She told the story of her mother, with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it. She mentioned sacrifice. She mentioned devotion. She mentioned more than once how much of the daily caretaking had fallen to her. People nodded. She held a cousin's hand and said something I couldn't hear, and the cousin pressed his forehead to hers. And they grieved together in the way people grieve publicly when they need someone to be watching. I was in the third row. I watched her work the receiving line. I watched her become the narrative. I said nothing. I watched an aunt, my mother's sister, a woman who had not spoken to me since the Sunday in the kitchen. I watched her face shift while my mother talked. It was small, the shift. A slight pause. A look toward the ceiling. The look of someone doing arithmetic. The attorney was in the back of the room. I didn't know who she was then. She introduced herself briefly at the end when most people had gone. She gave me a card. It said estate planning on it below her name. She shook my hand and looked at me directly and said, "There's a reading next Friday. You'll want to be there." Then she gave me a small nod. The The kind you give someone when you know something they don't know yet, but you want them to feel steady going in. I drove home and put her card on my kitchen counter, next to Marcus's coffee cup. My mother arrived at the attorney's office 12 minutes early. I know this because the receptionist mentioned it later, the way people mention things that were somehow characteristic. She had arrived early and arranged herself in the waiting room, and when the other beneficiaries filed in, she was already there, already positioned, already settled into the story of what was about to happen. I heard her say to a cousin just before the attorney came in, loud enough to reach me, "I just hope this is straightforward. I've been managing everything for years. I think we all know how this should go." The cousin nodded. The attorney came in. She was a small, precise woman. She opened the folder without ceremony and explained that Dorothy May had updated her estate documents 14 months prior, with a different attorney, one my mother had not known about. My mother's expression did not change at first. The attorney explained that the house was left to me. My mother's expression still did not change quite. The attorney explained that the annuity and the savings account, which were larger than anyone in the room had known, because my grandmother had a second account at a different bank, also not known about, were divided with a significant share to me, and the remainder in a small directed fund for the church's benevolence program. Then the attorney explained the other document. My grandmother had kept records, not just in the notebook, formal records, documented with her previous attorney, totaling the withdrawals my mother had made over 6 years. The document did not call them theft. It called them advances against inheritance, which meant they were already counted, which meant my mother had already received her share. The attorney read one line from my grandmother's written statement. It said, "I have always known what people are good at keeping track of." My mother stood up. She said that this was impossible. She said that she had given years of her life. She said that I had walked away from this family and showed up at the end like I deserved something. She said the word my mother always said about Marcus, not his name but the other word, the one she'd been saving, and she said it in a room full of people, some of whom had never heard her say it out loud, and you could feel the air change. The cousin who had nodded at my mother's earlier comment was sitting 2 seats down from me. She did not nod now. I stood up. I didn't have a speech. I had one thing. I said. She left the stove light on for me on Thursday mornings. I said it to the cousin, not to my mother. Then I picked up my bag and I walked out. My mother contested the will. The contest did not succeed. The documentation was too complete. My grandmother had been precise in a way that made the legal challenge expensive and ultimately indefensible, and after 4 months and what I understand were significant legal fees, the contest was withdrawn. My mother's public version of herself, the devoted daughter, the tireless caretaker, did not survive the conference room, because the withdrawals were now on record, not as allegation but as documentation, and the people who had believed the narrative had to decide what to do with the arithmetic. The aunt who had not spoken to me, my mother's sister, called me about 6 weeks after the reading. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't have a better word for it and she wasn't going to pretend she did. I told her I believed her. I did believe her. Not because it changed anything, but because she called and said the one plain word and didn't try to explain it into something smaller. My mother did not call. The quilt was finished in January. I finished it myself, the last 6 squares, following the arrangement my grandmother had already laid out. I knew where every piece went because she had told me over 2 years of Thursday afternoons where every piece went. It's in our living room now. Marcus picked the spot for it. The cardiologist appointment records and the spreadsheet I kept, the one I made not as a weapon but because the information needed to exist, those went to the attorney and then to the court record and then came back to me in a folder I keep in the filing cabinet. The one that doesn't close all the way. The coffee mug with the crooked handle is on the shelf in my kitchen. I use it. I've learned the angle you have to hold it so it doesn't feel unsteady. With part of the inheritance, I set up a small fund through the church's existing program. It covers prescription copays and transportation to medical appointments for elderly members of the congregation who have no one to drive them. It's called the Dot Fund. It has helped 11 people in the first year. It doesn't do anything grand. It covers the $17 gaps. It sits in the waiting room with a legal pad. It drives people on Thursdays. Does what she taught me to do. I would give back the house. I would give back all of it for one more evening washing dishes in the wrong order, while she told me about something I already knew. I would give it back for one more Thursday morning, the stove light on, her good shoes pointed toward the door. That's the truth of how these stories end. Not triumph. Just what you're left holding. The plain sentence at the center of all of this is, she watched me close the notebook, and that told her everything she needed to know. That's all it was. That's how trust actually works. If you have someone in your life who turned the light on for you, call them. Not tomorrow. Before you finish watching this. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. And I'll see you in the next one at You Said. Ya Storyful Ha.